In this lesson, we'll talk about unwrapping our UVs and also talk about creating seams in our UV layouts. So let's start with O4 begin in our project files, and it just has kind of a simple base character mesh and then also our basic cube that we'll start with. So when we talk about UVs, we've talked about the fact that it's like unwrapping our 3D geometry and flattening it down. And to be able to do that, we need to have cuts in certain areas. If we have an enclosed 3D object like this, especially, we'll need to have cuts because otherwise there's no way for it to disconnect and sort of be flattened out. You need to have some sort of cuts. Think about like a pattern that you would create out of fabric, something like that, or a cardboard box where you, in order to flatten it down, you would cut it along specific edges. So if we just select the cube and go to UVs and we just do an unwrap, it's going to take each one of those faces and make those the entire UV layout. There's no seams on this yet, so what we need to do is add some seams. So let's go ahead, and if we want to visualize this, you can add an image here and a grid, and that'll let you see that. And then you can come in here, and go to texture, and then you can see that each one of these faces is taking up that entire texture space, which is not really what we want. And so what we need to do is define some seams where the UVs can be cut and spread out. So let's see what happens if we just say, okay, I want all the edges to be seams. So we'll say all, and let's just mark those as seams. And then you can see that all of these edges are now red. That means when we create the UVs, they're going to be cut along any of those edges that are defined. In this case, all of our edges. So when we now select all of our polygons and we do an unwrap, you can see that now it separates all of those different faces. Now if we go in here and select based on our islands, we can see that these are all actually separated. So if I hit G, I can kind of move these around. You can see they're all separate. So it's gone in and made sure that along each of those defined edges, those have all been cut. Now this works okay, but what we really want to do is come to sort of a balance between the number of edges and the amount of distortion. Right now there's no distortion, but we have all of these seams. Now if we're using a 3D software application to paint, or we're painting in Blender, or we're painting in Mari or Mudbox or ZBrush, those seams are not going to be as important because it can kind of paint over those. But as a general rule, we want to have a kind of minimum number of seams that will allow us to get a nice non-deformed texture on our mesh. So you will have to have seams. It's just a question of where they're going to be and how many of them are going to be there. So for this cube, there is sort of probably a more optimal way than to cut every single edge. So instead of having all of these defined as seams, let's just choose a few. So I'm going to select all the edges, just hitting A, and we'll clear the seams. And now let's define this. So let's say that I want this kind of these central faces to be the main body of the UV island. Now, having said that, I know that I still want to be able to, or I'm still going to need to be able to cut that somewhere. It's going to have one, because otherwise it's a complete loop, and you won't be able to smash it down and have all of those faces undeformed. So let's choose one area, one edge to define as a seam. Okay, so we'll do this lower back edge. Okay, so we want it to be sort of out of the way. We don't want it to be in our face. We want to hide it. So that can unwrap, but now we still have all of these edges connected here. So what we can do is we'll select these three edges here, and then these three edges on this side. That leaves the top still connected to that central core. So let's mark those as seams. Okay, so we've got one edge down here and then three edges on each side. Let's select those polygons and do another unwrap. That looks a lot better. You see we have one island that's unfolded so that's not deformed. Can scale this down a little bit or move it around. So you can see here's our central core that we talked about, and then we've got the two extra face flaps that are sticking off the side. So think about that's kind of the minimum number of edges that we can cut and still be able to unfold that cardboard box to a completely flat shape without any distortion. Okay, and then we can move this island wherever we want within our UV layout. So the edges or the seams are really going to allow us to get a nice non-deformed islands. Let's take a look at what that means for us on our more complex object. So if we come over here and select this guy, it's kind of a low-res base mesh, you can see that I've actually already created some seams. Anywhere that you have kind of pieces of your mesh coming off of the surface, long noses or appendages and things like that, you're probably going to want to cut those around the base. And then if it's a cylinder like this, or if it's an enclosed mesh like that, you'll want to cut it also along the length, because think about a cylinder. Even if you cut this off as a cylinder, you can't flatten it down unless you also make a lengthwise cut as well. So all of these seams here, and you can take a look at this in your project files, these are the existing seams. So on these appendages, I've cut them around the base and then also along the length to be able to get that. And it can be a little bit of a trial and error. You can see with the main body, I've also cut it along the bottom here. It's kind of out of the way, but allows it to kind of unfold and lets you avoid having seams on the back there. Same thing with the head. I've cut around the base, and I've also made some cuts going up towards the face. I don't want to have any cuts here where there's going to be a lot of detail, but I do want to give it a little bit more room to spread out and get a nice non-distorted UV layout. So once you've got your seams created, again, you can just toggle that selection there. So let me select all the faces, and let's go ahead and unwrap those. And then you can see it's created those and added those into our layout there. And you can come in and see some of the different shells, the legs, the arms. So you can see that cylindrical. So this would be the kind of the base of the arm. And then this is that seam cut down the length of that cylinder shape. Here's the body, which with the seam going down the middle. And we'll talk more about editing the UV layout as we go. But the seams are going to go hand in hand with this unwrap, and they're going to allow you to get a very quick result just by doing some prep work, and that is selecting your seam. So once you get a little bit more practice with working with UVs, it'll become much more apparent where those seams need to go, and you'll be able to really quickly select those seams, put them in the right spots, and then do an unwrap and be able to have that come out. Just think about the seams as giving you the ability to spread out your UVs, flatten them down so you get a nice undistorted islands. Now there are ways of sort of automatically creating seams based on angles, and so in the next lesson we'll take a look at using Smart UV Project to do something just like that.